Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The following program is intended for mature audiences and may contain strong language, adult themes, and content of a violent and sexual nature which may not be appropriate for everyone. Welcome, listener, to the horror hill. If it's the darkness you seek, you won't be disappointed. I'm your host, Jason Hill, and it's time for our appointment. In this place, there is no sun, and nightmares do come true. Here, instead of shadow falling, the shadows follow you. Consider getting comfortable before the air grows colder. Prepare yourself, if you dare. Come, inch a little closer. If darkness is what you're after, seek no more, your search is through. You haven't found the darkness, traveler. The darkness has found you.
Good evening. You're listening to Horror Hill. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6. I'm your host, Jason Hill, and I'm thrilled you could join me tonight. In tonight's episode, courtesy of authors R.K. Kombrinck and Hunter Lowe, come two bone-chilling tales about ambivalent arrivals and malevolent motels. All of tonight's tales are featured in the incredible horror anthology, Daylight Dims Volume 2, and are featured here with the kind permission of their authors. The sequel to the original, and equally fantastic, Daylight Dims. Volume 2 features 13 stories that cross the genres of surreal, dark fantasy and heart-pounding dread, guaranteed to twist your perception of horror. From the common, comfortable tropes to the more taboo, these hand-picked tales have a literary aspect designed to showcase what true horror can be. If you'd like to support the authors and editors behind tonight's frightening fiction, you'll find a link to the book in our episode notes. Or visit simplyscarypodcast.com/daylightdims2 with the number 2 at the end. Or simply search for it on Amazon.com. You can also learn more about the books in the series at daylightdims.com. You're listening to the standard edition of this program. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy ad-free versions of this and all our other episodes, and I know I would, as well as hundreds of tales from our audio archives dating back to 2012, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today to get instant access from our friends at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Thank you for your support. Now, without further ado, allow me to escort you to a place where the sun dies and nightmares come to life, where those who seek the darkness need look no further. Welcome, listener, to the Horror Hill. You haven't found the darkness. The darkness has found you. Our first tale of terror this evening comes to us courtesy of author R.K. Kombrinck. In it, we'll meet Amanda and her urban explorer friends who have their minds set on visiting a dilapidated motel with a rich, dark history. What sinister secrets does this decrepit destination have in store for our intrepid travelers exactly? Well, stay tuned and find out. Without further ado, I present to you permanent residence. They caught sight of the motel from the bridge that crossed the highway. It squatted on a kidney-shaped plot of pavement, surrounded on three sides by trees and dark hills. There was nothing and no one else around for miles. "There it is." Amanda reached out and grasped Wendy's hand, squeezing tightly. She was excited. They had done the silo facility in Chillicothe. They'd walked the 3 miles of track to the derelict rail depot in Hartwell. They'd explored the one-room schoolhouse in Cleves, the old factory in Hyde Park, and the deserted neighborhood off the highway behind Lookout Acres. All had been thoroughly boring, and Amanda wanted something more. A place with a rich, dark history. She'd almost given up on finding one when she'd overheard 2 girls in the university's common area talking about the Murder Motel. She'd asked some questions, done some Googling, and discovered the thing she'd been looking for had been hiding in plain sight, right under her nose. It had been something of a 9 days wonder back in the fall of 1983. News outlets across the state had run the story of how a man named Terry Lawton had come stumbling into the front office of the Royal Motel just after sunset, waving a pistol. He murdered 6 employees and 2 guests before turning the gun on himself. His wife's body was discovered at the couple's home, a hunting knife jammed deep in her belly, her guts spoiling on the kitchen floor. Their 7-year-old daughter, Jackie, was never seen again. The Royal Motel was shut down quietly and left to rot. No developers came to rehab it. No one bulldozed it to build something else in its place. It just sat, empty and waiting. People forgot the name Terry Lawton, forgot the names of the victims. It was regulated to the late-night conversations in bars and truck stops, and even that eventually dried up. For years, the story lay as dormant as the motel itself. Then, after some time passed, it found a second, vivid life amongst the kind of people who could really appreciate gruesome tales of blood and tragedy. All the kids say that a group of devil worshippers started using the place for rituals, that they had orgies and called up demons and communicated with the ghosts of the people who died there. Amanda grinned as she spun the yarn. They'd left the bridge and turned onto a road rough from neglect and full of potholes. Another story says a group of paranormal investigators went out there to stay overnight and study the place. They ran out screaming after only 3 hours. They disbanded the group and never spoke of that night again. Clark leaned forward from the back seat, pushing his face between the 2 sisters. The sun was bright, and he squinted out from beneath his red knit cap. "Is that true?" She shrugged. "Who knows? Probably not. The only thing that's for sure is that 9 people died there. The rest are just rumors." She raised her eyebrow theatrically. "But there are a lot of rumors. Everybody at Bridalfield has a story about this place, and there's a couple of websites that mention it." They bumped along for another couple of miles until the pines suddenly swept back from the road. A thick metal pole reached up from the scrub, topped with a sign that proclaimed Royal Motel, air-conditioned, free HBO. Just beyond that, on the right, lay their destination. A sagging 2-level affair, it sprawled in the shadows of the encroaching woods. Its yellow paint had faded almost to white. There was a check-in office at one end, and a tunnel which cut through to the rear of the motel. Every 10 feet or so were rooms, closed white doors accompanied by large naked windows. Further down were 2 stairways to the 2nd floor, and a glass enclosure where a long-dead ice machine hulked. Wendy pulled into the parking lot, stirring drifts of dead leaves. No other cars passed down the road. They had the place to themselves. "Damn. This is legit." Clark's tone was hushed and respectful. "Yeah." Wendy shut off the ignition. "But I wish it was closer to home. It's going to be dark soon. We should have started earlier." Amanda undid her seatbelt. "We can spend the night in my dorm if you want. It'll be quiet. Everybody's gone for the holiday." She opened her door and stepped out onto the pavement. A smile spread across her face as she drank in the squalid atmosphere. Chipped and peeling paint, the empty flower pot outside the office door, the ghosts of parking space lines. She was in love. She pulled her pack from the front seat and began rummaging through it. Clark got out and stood next to her, stretching. He looked back in at Wendy. "Yeah, that's a good plan. We can all spend the night together. In your dorm room, I mean." Makes sense. Amanda glanced over at him, amused to see his face had gone bright red beneath his scruffy beard. "Yeah, we can't use my roommate's bed, so we're all going to have to squeeze into mine." She pulled her camera from her pack and began snapping pictures. Wendy stepped out and stood by the car. After a moment's consideration, she wrapped her scarf around her neck. It had been unseasonably warm for late November, but it was cold in the shade of the motel. She sniffed the air. "Oh, what's that smell?" The artificial click of Amanda's digital camera went off and the flash bloomed. "I don't smell anything." She was fascinated with the grime on the windows. It made patterns that looked like handprints. Clark went around to Wendy's side and leaned against the car. "No, there's definitely a smell. It's like dead leaves, moldy carpet, and raccoon shit." His voice dropped to an ominous growl. "Or maybe it's the lingering stench of death." He chuckled and lit a cigarette. "Don't be a dick. People died here." Wendy shut the driver's side door and sidled over to her sister. "Is this one creepy enough for you?" Amanda kept taking pictures, her eyes on the view screen, but she spoke as she moved the camera around. "Another thing they say is that sometimes people driving by at night see lights on in the windows, and sometimes they see shadows in those lit-up rooms." Wendy hugged herself and shivered. "Maybe people are staying here, squatters or something." Amanda looked up from her camera. "And who's paying the electric bill?" She slipped the camera strap over her shoulder and hoisted her pack. "You guys ready to explore?" Without waiting for an answer, she strode across the parking lot towards the front office. She stepped over a parking block onto the walk. Stubborn weeds clawed their way up between the cracks in the cement. She pressed her face up to the plate glass that fronted the office and put her hands to either side, trying to see in. This was where Terry Lawton had gunned down 4 of his 8. Actually, it was 10, counting the wife and little girl, she reminded herself. Victims. The night manager, the front desk clerk, and 2 maids. She felt a morbid thrill knowing that blood had been spilled just a few feet away. The window was nearly opaque with dust and grit, and it was very dark inside. She couldn't make out anything at all. She tried the door and found it locked, just as she'd expected. No big deal. She had her lockpicking kit. She heard Wendy and Clark shuffling up behind her and turned to face them. "I say we start with the rear of the building, cut through the tunnel, see what's back there, maybe try a few of the rooms, then make our way back here. Finish with the office. What do you guys think?" Wendy chewed on her lower lip. She looked uncomfortable. "How many rooms do you want to go through? I mean, we can't stay here long. It's already 3:30. "Jesus, Wen, we drove all this way. We're going to check out as many rooms as we can. We've got flashlights." "Sorry, I was just asking." Clark tossed his cigarette to the ground and put his hand on Wendy's arm. "Don't worry about it. We'll be all right." She gave him a withering look and shrugged his hand off. "I know, I was just asking." Amanda left them behind. She went into the tunnel that connected the front of the motel to the rear. It was dark inside. An overlapping and confusing road map of graffiti spread out across the walls. She stepped back, trying to take all of it in. A lot of it was the usual childish vulgarity. Depictions of huge penises, impossibly large breasts, pot leaves, and the names of heavy metal bands. She particularly liked the one that said, "April Priest plus beer equals blowjobs." Some of it, however, was quite strange. She took her camera and began shooting pictures. Each time the flash went off, it illuminated a small piece of the chaotic puzzle. Flash. 8 small figures in silhouette holding hands, their eyes round white holes. Flash. A crude drawing of a little girl in a dress and pigtails. Blank white eyes and her mouth drawn down in an exaggerated frown. Flash. La niña quiere comer su alma. Salir y permanecer fuera hermanos. Flash. A bouquet of thorny stems crowned not with flowers, but with crescent-shaped eyes. Flash. Say hi to Jackie for me. Flash. Jackie sucks dicks. Below this, the addendum. Jackie eats, with a Z, dicks. Get it straight, fucker. Flash. Everybody up. Amanda's here, encircled by a chain of white eyes. Amanda stumbled back, nearly dropping her camera. She leaned forward, so close her nose almost touched the wall. The circle of eyes was there, but what she'd thought were words now just looked like greasy black streaks. Her mind had played a little prank on her. She smiled as she turned and examined the writing on the opposite wall. This is exactly what I wanted. She shouldered her camera and headed cheerfully to the rear of the motel. She stepped out of the tunnel and into what had once been the Royal Motel's recreational area. To her right, a small structure stuck out perpendicular from the main building. It had no windows, just a gaping doorway. Faded paintings of Pac-Man, Q*bert, and Space Invaders decorated the front wall. She wondered if any of the old games were still in there, shrouded in cobwebs. She doubted it. People had been out here. Someone would have spirited them away if the owners had been stupid enough to leave them in the first place. A concrete courtyard spread out from the arcade across the back of the building. A few old weather-stained lounge chairs were strewn here and there. To her left, a bit further back, was a small swimming pool surrounded by a low fence. The gate had been torn away and left discarded on the ground. Amanda could see that the pool was half full of dark water. A breeze blew across it, carrying an odor like drowned things. A child's deflated pink intertube floated listlessly at the surface. It was the only spot of color to be found. Everything else was gray and damp. She wrinkled her nose but was delighted all the same. Smells like dead fish. Wendy had come through the tunnel and Clark was standing behind her. I know. Amanda set her pack on the ground and hunkered down next to it. She opened it and began taking items out. She set a flashlight head down in the concrete, then placed a small plastic box next to it. As she did this, she heard Clark exclaim behind her, "Oh shit, is that an arcade?" "All signs point to yes." Amanda flipped the lid of her case, revealing a set of small tools. "Why don't you go check it out? You can take my light." "It's all right, I've got one." He padded off to the arcade as she stood. She saw that her sister wore an amusing expression of boredom mixed with unease. Amanda knew the only reason Wendy went on these excursions was because she wanted to show everyone she was more than just a pretty face. She gamely clambered through garbage-strewn trailers, rodent-infested basements, and crumbling factories. She took photos and commented on blog posts, but Amanda knew she had no real interest in these lonely places. They were very different women. Wendy was tall, brunette, and gorgeous, while Amanda was small, athletic, and blonde. They were both intelligent, but everyone seemed to regard Amanda as the smart one, and it rankled Wendy. "You okay, sis?" Amanda pulled off her gloves and stuffed them into her jacket pockets. Wendy shrugged. "Yeah, just tired and cold. What happened to the sun? Feels like the temperature's dropped 20 degrees since we got here." "Well, the trees keep it pretty shady, and it's breezy." Amanda started towards one of the rooms that faced the courtyard. "Want to come in here with me?" Before she had a chance to answer, Clark came out of the arcade. His eyes sparkled. "You guys gotta see this. There's a bunch more of that crazy shit spray painted all over the walls and ceiling. Names, little nursery rhymes, weird drawings. No games, though." Estelle was disappointed for a moment, but bounced right back. "The creepiest part is that there's handprints in the dust all over it. Give me the camera." Amanda placed it in Clark's outstretched hand. "I'll see it in a bit. I want to get into these rooms first." "I'll come with you, Clark." Wendy turned her back to the motel. Amanda saw Clark smiling widely and felt a string of annoyance. He was so predictable. She watched them go into the arcade, and a moment later the flash of the camera began lighting up the darkness within. She turned and walked past the iron stairway that led from the courtyard to the second floor. She stepped beneath the overhang and walked up to a door. Room 21. Through the window, she could vaguely make out the shape of what was probably a bed frame. She tried the knob. It was locked. That made sense. All of the doors probably were. She selected one of the little tools in her case and slipped it into the lock, wiggling it back and forth. After a moment, there was a click and the knob turned in Amanda's hand. Her heart sped up as she pushed the door open and stepped into the room. She switched on her flashlight and moved the beam across the room. The metal bed frame was there, and that was about it. The room had been stripped of furniture, and the carpet had been torn up in a few places, showing bald cement. It felt empty. Well, of course, why shouldn't it? And disappointing. She gave it 30 seconds of attention before backing out of it and moving on. She pulled the door shut and then, on impulse, tried to open it again. It had locked automatically. She walked along to the next room and jimmied the lock without even trying it first. In this room, the bed came complete, mattress and all, with a filthy blanket scrunched up at the foot. A side table with 2 drawers sat aside the bed against the wall, and a long, low dresser sprawled beneath the window. She moved to the side of the bed and leaned over, touching the mattress. She had expected it to be damp for some reason, but it was bone dry. A cloud of dust puffed up around her hand. The springs screeched as she lowered herself onto it. She settled in and looked around the room. Amanda had really hoped to find some personal items, artifacts left behind by the last guests to stay here, or even junk that transients and squatters had forgotten. Anything that would connect to a human presence. She trained the flashlight's beam downward and swept it along the floor. More dust, more cobwebs, nothing else. She began opening the dresser drawers. The first 2 were empty. The third one contained a very large, hairy spider, and Amanda slammed it shut with a gasp. She uttered a breathless giggle and drew the last one open cautiously, shining the light in. A pencil rolled across the bottom. That was it. With a disappointed grunt, she leaned over and opened the top drawer of the side table. Inside was a thick, cheaply bound book. Well, now we're getting somewhere, she thought as she lifted the book out, giving it a good shake to dislodge any creepy-crawly stowaways. Someone had tried to blot out the title with black ink, but it was stamped into the cover and clearly legible. Holy Bible. Well, shit. Amanda felt a queasy wave of excitement in her belly. She tried to flip through it and found all the pages were stuck together. Someone had glued them shut. She was intrigued and turned to deface scriptures this way and that. She ran her thumb across the pages and found that it opened in the center of the book. She laid it open on the bed beside her. The original text had been pasted over with notebook paper, and something was written on it in tight little letters. She held out a light and bent over. As she did, Wendy and Clark's shadows passed in the front of the dirty window. She heard the door to the next room open as they entered. They thumped around, their voices muffled but loud. So much for not wanting to explore the rooms. It irritated Amanda that the only reason her sister was rooting around in there was because Clark was with her. Somehow he coaxed her into a room when Amanda could not. His crush was becoming unbearable. It had sneaked in and devoured a part of their friendship. It didn't matter though, because Wendy would never give him what he wanted. Another part of Amanda wondered why it never even occurred to him to try and see if she would. Because Wendy is the pretty one. That's why. She shook the sour thoughts away and concentrated on trying to make out the writing on the pages pasted into the Bible. The handwriting was cramped and seemed to be in a language that Amanda couldn't even guess at, though every so often English words and phrases were peppered in. She read aloud, pronouncing as best she could. Briexo gulis bub sum nilshug, al kurit upsharsen, mene takil bub, marked by its lividity, shub gomthog yoth kamog, sibyl nog bub helshig, aggrieved and unburied, lish koilarig sebs. The thumping next door suddenly intensified. It sounded like someone was hitting the wall just on the other side. Ugh, is she actually letting him fuck her? Amanda grimaced, disgusted at the thought. God, they know I'm in here. It was like they were doing it just to mess with her. Normally, she would find the idea ridiculous, but here, in this dark room with dust floating around her like dirty snow, it seemed completely reasonable. She stood from the bed, snapped the Bible closed, and stuffed it into her jacket pocket. She explored the rest of the room, shining her light in every gloomy corner and crevice. The bathroom was empty, and the closets held nothing but a couple of theft-proof wooden hangers. It seemed this room had given her everything it had. The Bible was a nice relic, though, and she couldn't wait to get it home and start researching the writing on the notebook paper. Someone, somewhere, had to have an idea of what it meant. As she reached for the knob, there was another thump from the room next door, and she rolled her eyes impatiently. Jesus Christ, guys! She opened the door, expecting the sudden onrush of daylight to dazzle her, but the sky had dimmed considerably. In fact, the sun had sunk low behind the hills, and the shadows of the pines stretched out long. Amanda pulled her phone from her pocket. The clock said 4:28. She stared at it for a few seconds and then looked stupidly back up at the sky, trying to reconcile the two. It couldn't have been much later than 3:40 when she'd gone into the room, and it seemed to her that she'd only been inside for 9 or 10 minutes at most. She moved slowly towards the next room, intending to ask Wendy and Clark if they'd noticed her long absence. Of course they hadn't. She reached out and knocked on the door. There was no reply. No sound of any kind. She knocked again and called out. Guys? Hey guys, you in there? Nothing. No more of the thumping. No more voices. She decided to just walk in and hope they'd finished. The doorknob was cold against her hand as she closed her fingers around it and turned. It was locked. She jiggled the knob, but it wouldn't budge. She leaned in close, putting her ear against the door. She strained to catch any sound from within. She swept her hair behind her neck and pressed more tightly. Was that something? A tapping? Just on the other side of the door? Maybe not. If it had been there at all, it was gone now. She pounded on the door and shouted, Hey, this is bullshit! It's not funny! Hey! The sound of her first rapping against the mute wood echoed across the pavement, startling some birds from the trees. There was no reply. She stepped away from the door. They weren't in there. She turned slowly and surveyed the courtyard. In the thickening shade, the swimming pool was black, the inner tube drifting listlessly across it, urged on by the breeze. The ruined gates that surrounded it were skeletal silhouettes. They offered no answers. She took one last look at the door and considered letting herself in with her pick. After a moment, she decided instead to try the next room down. She picked the lock and entered. The dark of the room was thicker than the last two. She turned on her flashlight and swung the beam around. She felt hurried now, less genuinely curious, and anxious about being caught there after sundown. She didn't need to see the bathroom, and there was no dresser or table in this room for her to explore. Just a bare bed frame. She was turning to the door when something on the carpet caught her eye. It was small and bright, startling against the dingy gray nap. It was a business card. She knelt and picked it up, shining her light on it. NOPE, Northern Ohio Paranormal Examiners. Getting to know the unknown. Matt Lauritsen, MS, Bridlefield University. So a paranormal group really had come out here. Shit. She shook the thought away with a jerk of her head. So what? She stood and shoved the card into her pocket next to the Bible. Not bothering to take a last look around, she stepped out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. Guys? Her voice was small. Where the hell were they? Amanda went back to the arcade, very aware of how quickly the sky was darkening. Wendy? Clark? She stepped through the doorway into the quiet. She switched on her flashlight. Dust swam in the air. She looked around the room, and her breath caught in her throat. There was graffiti on the walls and ceiling, as Clark had said, but he'd gotten it wrong. There were no words, no obscene pictures. Just hundreds, maybe thousands of eyes. All shapes and sizes, some detailed, some simple, all staring at her. She backed away from the wall and tripped over something in the middle of the floor. She landed hard on her rear and dropped the flashlight. It spun a few times and came to rest with the beam trained on what had tangled up her feet. The camera. She snatched it up by the strap and stood. She thumbed the power button and the little green light came on with a mechanical whine. She couldn't understand why Clark would leave it lying there. She turned on the view mode to see what the last picture he'd taken had been. It was a shot of Wendy in the doorway, framed by gray daylight. She wasn't smiling. There was a strange smudge in the background over her shoulder. Amanda pressed the little plus sign, enlarging the picture and scrolling it slightly to the right. It wasn't a smudge, but a shadow. A person standing behind her sister. The sun was almost gone, a fading pink glow behind the silent pines. She stepped out into the shady courtyard and yelled as loudly as she could. "Wendy! Wendy, please!" She desperately hoped they were messing with her. She wouldn't even be mad. She was ready to leave now. Her footfalls were loud as she hurried across the pavement. She turned and went into the tunnel, calling for her sister as she went. She had never wanted to see Wendy as badly as this before in her life. A knot of dark worry bloomed in her chest. She needed her sister, needed to wrap her arms around her beautiful shoulders and feel her rightness. Amanda could see the car out in the front parking lot. It was running, and the headlights were on. The front doors were thrown open wide, but no one was inside. She was about to step into the parking lot when she realized with a start that something was wrong with the tunnel. She shined her flashlight across the walls and gasped. All the writing had disappeared, replaced by more mute, indifferent eyes. She remembered chuckling at the silliness of the adolescent graffiti. April Priest plus beer equals blowjobs. She knew it had been there. A scream crawled up her throat, but she struggled fiercely to keep it inside. She did not want to lose control. She turned away from the eyes. What if they started blinking? And rushed to the car. The heater was running. Amanda stuck her head in the driver's side and glanced in the back. It was empty. Only Wendy's scarf lying abandoned on her seat gave any indication she'd been there. There was no sign of Clark at all. Amanda's heart was pounding. She turned and looked back at the motel. Where could they be? They had to be fucking around with her. They had to be. She sat down behind the wheel and switched the ignition off. No sense wasting gas. She pressed down on the horn, letting it blast for a long time. She slammed her fist down on it in a staccato beat. Why weren't they coming out, laughing at her for being scared? This had all been her idea. This had been what she wanted. A really spooky location to explore, a bad place. It would be hilarious for them to turn the tables on her. Mean, maybe, but funny in a dark way. Teach her a lesson. She knew now that she needed one, about showing respect for the past and the places that still reeked of it. Minutes passed and the cold crept in. The only sound was Amanda's breathing. She pulled the door shut and the windows fogged up. She tried calling Wendy's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She thought about dialing the police, but what would she say? That she and her friends had been trespassing on a piece of property where a bunch of people had been murdered years ago, just to poke around for laughs. And now her sister and friend had somehow disappeared. That maybe they were playing a cruel joke on her, but she was terrified that they weren't. The longer she waited in silence with the dark drawing down, the idea seemed less and less crazy. She had just pressed the 9 and the 1 on her keypad when a voice called out in the gloom. "Amanda, hey!" It was Clark. She flung the door open and jumped out. At first, she couldn't tell where his voice was coming from. She scanned the front of the motel and was startled to realize he was leaning out the open door of the office. How the hell did they get in there? "Asshole! What's wrong with you?" She tried to sound angry, but the relief in her voice was impossible to hide. She almost wanted to laugh. "Come on, let's get out of here." "Not yet. Come in here. There's something you've got to see." Amanda rolled her eyes. She had lost all desire to explore the Royal Motel. She'd seen enough. As far as she was concerned, it was time to maybe look for a new hobby altogether. She shook her head and called back. "No, come on, I'm cold. Where's Wendy?" "She's in here. She wants you to see this. Hurry up." His small form, barely visible in the dark, disappeared back into the office, letting the door snick shut. Amanda was annoyed all over again. These two were real pieces of work. She left the car behind and strode to the door. They were acting like mean little kids, bullies. They were probably hiding in there, waiting for her to enter so they could jump out and scare her. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She would steel herself for the shock and show no reaction. She reached out and pulled the door open. She stepped into the heavy darkness and readied herself for whatever they had in store for her. She realized too late what a horrible mistake she'd made. The door closed behind her, enfolding her in darkness, but she could still see well enough to know the room was full of people. Arms, legs, bellies, eyes, and feet swam out of the shadows. With a choked scream, she threw herself back against the door. It wouldn't budge. The people in the dark didn't move. They just watched as she flung herself over and over against the unyielding glass, pounding her fists uselessly. She cried and called for help, called for Wendy and Clark, and beat at the door. It wouldn't open. She tried to punch through the glass, but it was too thick. No one made a sound behind her, not until she slid to the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks, sobs turning to exhausted dry heaves. Then a voice spoke up, one she had never heard before. The voice of a little girl. "No time for that now, Amanda. Everybody's here." There was a childish giggle, and sudden light filled the room. Amanda didn't want to turn around. Every instinct she had cried out against it. But of course she did. Ancient dead bulbs in the ceiling glowed with phantom power, revealing the small crowd who stood watching her. 5 men, 3 women, their clothes filthy and tattered, stained with age and blood. One of the women was missing her right eye along with most of the right side of her face. Her hair was a matted bird's nest that hung over the dark wound like a curtain, and Amanda could see bugs squirming in it. Another, a man wearing a loud sport coat and jeans, had a ragged hole in his shirt, just above his belt. Something was hanging out of the tear. Something that looked like gray-black sausage, clotted with dark sludge. He regarded her from behind lightly tinted glasses, unperturbed by her scrutiny. She looked from face to face. They all watched her wordlessly. Their eyes were sad. Flies buzzed everywhere. She could feel them lighting on her cheeks and brows and flitting away again. And there was a smell, thick, rank, and horribly sweet. "I am sharing a room with ghosts. I wish I was a ghost." The gravelly voice came from a corner off to her left. Against her better judgment, she turned to look. Sitting against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. A broad-shouldered man covered in dust. A spray of maroon spread out across the wall just above his head, stark in the sallow light. The revolver he'd used to kill himself and the other 8 people in the room lay at his side, garlanded with cobwebs. Ghosts don't know they're dead. Oh, stop being grumpy. It was the young girl's voice again. Amanda snapped her head around and found herself face to face with its owner. She was 7 or 8 years old. When she died, a merciless part of Amanda's mind amended, with long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a strawberry shortcake t-shirt with frilly sleeves over a pair of red gym shorts. The shirt was a bit faded but clean, as was the girl's hair and skin. Her eyes were bright, her face fresh. She was in complete contrast to the other things that shared the room with her. It was perhaps in deference to this distinction that their dead eyes glowed with adoration as they gazed down upon the little girl. She drew very close to Amanda and smiled. Her teeth were white and perfect, but her breath, her breath was vile, like the wet, clogged odor of the swimming pool out back, but much stronger, much closer. Jackie? Amanda had known the moment she'd heard the girl's voice, but now, looking at her, breathing in her foul reek, it seemed necessary to say out loud, "You're Jackie Lawton." The girl's face lit up, delighted, but not surprised. "Yep, and you're Amanda Corcoran. I'm glad you came." From the corner, the dead, but not ghostly, he'd been very clear on that. Terry Lawton moaned miserably. "I'm sorry. I thought they brought her here to kill her. I didn't know." The mirth drained from Jackie's eyes and she spoke through suddenly clenched jaws. "Daddy, I told you to stop being so grumpy." He sobbed, or maybe he chuckled. It was hard to tell, but words kept spilling from his spoiled lips. "They brought her here, but that's what she wanted. It's what she was waiting for. How could I know? Oh, Sharon, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she had that knife. I could have stopped her, maybe." His voice gurgled and rasped. Jackie's face suddenly snapped away from Amanda. It flew back towards her father's body, carried on a neck grown suddenly long and thin. Her ponytail flew out behind her head like a poisonous comet's tail, and the sound of her teeth, chomping together, was hideously loud as she spoke. "Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up! I told you never to talk about Mama! Never, ever, ever!" Now it was clear the man was laughing. It was an awful sound. "Or what? You can't make this any worse. I'll say what I want. You're the one who killed her. You were a terrible daughter." His words dissolved into a series of wheezing coughs that in turn lapsed back into sludgy, underwater gurgles. "I spared her this." Jackie's voice was no longer like a little girl's. It wasn't like anything human at all anymore. It was as if the buzz of cicadas in high summer had formed into words. "Because I loved her best. I loved her only. I spared her so you would suffer this, Daddy." The head pulled back on the serpentine neck, a triumphant sneer wrinkling her lips. "I'm leaving you here. My flock is coming with me, but you'll stay behind with the new residents." Terry Lawton's face crumpled with fear and terror. "No. I'm sorry, sweetie. I take it back. Please, please, please don't leave me here with them. Please, Jackie. Please!" With horrifying speed, Jackie thrust her hand forward and clamped her open mouth over her father's. For a moment, it looked like they were sharing a deep, lover's kiss. But then Jackie pulled back violently, Terry's brown tongue dangling between her teeth. She tossed her head back, letting it slide down her gullet like a pelican, swallowing a fish, and then smiled. I told you to stop talking. As if this pronouncement had some other significance, the dead people in the office all raised their hands above their heads in unison and chanted in low, hissing tones. Midhor chagro lor shubkamag. Midhor chagro lor shubkamag. Jackie swung her head back to Amanda, hovering above her like a jack-o'-lantern. Her eyes had become huge, empty sockets that glowed bright white, and her teeth had grown long and sharp. But when she spoke, her voice was that of a little girl again. I'm sorry to leave you with him, but he should be quieter now. Amanda had no idea she would ever be able to speak again, but she surprised herself by responding. What do you mean? Where's my sister? Where's Wendy? Jackie's grin spread to an impossible width. Even in this form, childish glee capered on her face, and it was abominable. She sang in her high, sweet voice. Wendy, Wendy, her arms and legs are bendy. Before she could stop it, Amanda's hand flew from her side and struck the monstrous face hanging in the air before her. It was like striking warm, wet clay. She recoiled with a gasp, but couldn't contain her words any more than she could her open palm. Where's my sister, you fucking whore? Jackie's crooning abruptly ceased. She closed her mouth and regarded Amanda solemnly. It seemed like a long time passed. Minutes. Hours. It was hard to say. Silence crept in. The dead watched impassively. Terry hadn't moved in some time. He just sat in his corner with his head cradled in his arms. Amanda got the idea she was dreaming, maybe sick with a terrible fever, and relief began to flood through her. But then, she got a strong whiff of the room and of Jackie's breath, and knew it was no dream. Finally, Jackie spoke. My flock, my friends, picked this place because they were waiting for me to be born. They knew I would be special. In fact, they helped bring me here, to this world. Her human voice had been left behind for good. Her words buzzed and rattled. They spent years reading books, learning languages. They hurt people, they killed people. They watched for signs, and when I was born, they found me. My daddy didn't know what I was, but I think my mama did. She knew, but she didn't care. She loved me anyway. That's why I let her die free. At that, Terry moaned hollowly, but Jackie didn't waste even a glance on him. She just looked deep into Amanda's eyes, droning like the voice of madness. They didn't expect Daddy to show up here with his gun. He thought they killed her and kidnapped me. He followed them back here. They thought he spoiled their plans. The ritual. But I knew it was going to happen that way. It must. There always has to be a sacrifice. I told them we'd walked out of here in the darkness and glory, but I never said they would be walking out alive. This place has to be fed, guarded, tended, and fed. Always. Someone always has to stay behind. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. She stretched her tiny hand out so far beneath her floating head and reached into Amanda's jacket pocket. She grasped the defaced Bible and pulled it free, clutching it against her chest. People have come and gone before. Some of them sensed us. Some of them saw us. We could always show little bits and pieces of ourselves, aspects, whispers, visions. No one ever stayed here very long, though. Even the ones who came looking for us. But you pressed on, and you found this. Our absolution. Amanda's thoughts were a muddy swirl of fear and confusion, but the memory of reading the words from the Bible cut through the haze with cold clarity. Fresh tears began to spill down her cheeks. She'd never felt so lost before in her life. Wendy. She just wanted to see her sister. That was the only thought that seemed to have any light to it. If only she could see Wendy, then maybe things could still be all right. Jackie nodded, her ponytail bobbing joyfully to and fro. Yes, maybe it's time for you to see your sister and your friend. Would you like that? The words sounded like poison in the demon's mouth, but Amanda nodded vehemently. She didn't care what came next. The idea of seeing Wendy at that moment had become everything. Jackie reared up off the floor. Her neck had retracted, bringing her head closer to her body, but the rest of her had begun to change shape. Her arms and legs had multiplied while she'd been speaking with Amanda. 6, 8. It was hard to tell how many limbs she now had, and they'd grown longer and many-jointed. Her back was bowed inward and elongated, tearing free of the strawberry shortcake shirt, and she seemed fuller, plumper. Amanda saw these things and understood somewhere deep inside that she should be screaming and pounding her head against the glass of the front door until she lost consciousness. But her love and concern for Wendy would not allow that to happen. Not yet. The Jackie thing, now standing 6 feet above the filthy floor, skittered with anthropodic grace across the room. Her retinue of dead worshippers stepped to either side to allow her passage, and she disappeared into the room behind what had once been the check-in desk. Amanda waited, trying not to think about the flies crawling in her hair, the chill of all those lifeless eyes upon her, or the way Jackie's abdomen had undulated between her spindly legs as she moved away. She tried to think about nothing other than seeing her sister. She didn't wait long. A few minutes after Jackie had disappeared into the back, 2 shadows came shuffling into the room. They shoved past the small, silent congregation that huddled beneath the fluorescent ghost lights and stopped in front of Amanda, swaying gently. Amanda took one look at her sister Wendy, whom she'd built tents out of blankets with when they were little, who'd been the first person she called when she lost her virginity, who she'd confessed her stupid, useless crush on Clark to, and began to scream. Wendy's face had been smashed in. Her jaw had been wrenched horribly to one side and crushed. Her lips were split wide, exposing shredded gums and a jumble of teeth. Her beautiful dark hair was matted to her face with dark, tacky blood. Her nose had been obliterated, reduced to a red, wet channel. Her eyes were bright, though, bright and aware, and staring at Amanda with dull hate. Beside her, Clark stood with his head twisted nearly around backwards, his skull crushed above the right temple. One eye socket had been fractured, and his eyeball had sunk into it, caught in the oozing crack. Blood and brains leaked from the gash in his head and down onto the collar of his coat in pink and red lumps. His good eye was also trained on Amanda, sad and afraid. Jackie reappeared behind and above them. She was huge now, almost filling the room. She had sprouted long dragonfly-like wings that shimmered in the sick light. She'd shed her clothes and her body had become segmented. Eyes like white toadstools opened up all along her sides, lidless and glistening. The worst, though, was that her face was still more or less that of the little girl she had been. Amanda, summoning the last bit of sanity she possessed, howled angrily at the creature towering over the bodies of her sister and friend.
You killed them! Oh God, you killed Wendy!
The thing that had never really been a little girl named Jackie Lawton at all opened its mouth and laughed in its nightmare drone. Me? Don't be silly. I've never killed anyone. You did that. Amanda rose up off the floor, her fear and grief buried under an avalanche of cold fury. She could stand no more lies. She would beat this monster into the floor with a heavy, blood-soaked flashlight she held in her left hand before finding a way to... When had she picked up the flashlight? She remembered leaving it in the car with her pack, didn't she? How had it gotten bloody like that? Whose hair was matted to the front plate? She looked back up and the room was empty. Jackie was gone. Her dead acolytes were gone. Terry Lawton was gone. All was dark, but she still had the flashlight in her hand. She thumbed the switch and it came on. The light filtered through a red haze. She shone it around the room. Not everyone had gone. Wendy and Clark lay on the floor in pools of drying blood. They didn't move. After all of that, it was strange to see dead people acting dead. She aimed the beam of the light around the room. One other thing seemed to have been left behind. Terry Lawton's pistol. She crawled over to where it lay and sat up against the wall, drawing her legs up to her chest. She set the flashlight down and picked the gun up. She wondered if it had any shots left. She pulled the hammer back and heard the chamber click into place. Her curiosity grew. She wondered how the barrel would feel in her mouth. After a moment, she put it between her lips to find out. It was cold. She sat that way for a while before she realized someone else was in the room with her. She looked up and in the light cast by the flashlight saw the silhouette of a young girl just inside the door. A voice that reminded her of summertime and mosquito bites whispered to her, "This place feeds on tragedy." Amanda nodded. She'd finally figured that out. Sometime later, she realized she was alone again. The batteries in the flashlight died. She didn't know if her eyes were open or closed. But the gun was still in her mouth. With a sigh, she leaned her head against the wall and pulled the trigger. They caught sight of the motel from the bridge that crossed the highway. It squatted on a kidney-shaped plot of pavement, surrounded on three sides by trees and dark hills. There was nothing and no one else for miles. "There it is," the older boy said to the younger one from astride his bike. "They found the bodies of her sister and her boyfriend in room 23. Their heads were busted open. She beat them both to death with her flashlight, and there was brains everywhere." The younger boy paled. He'd begun to regret coming along on this trip. Brains? Yeah, everywhere. And more brains where she killed herself in the front office. Dibs on any cool stuff we find, like bullet casings. Oh, all right. The younger boy had no qualms giving up dibs on anything they might find in the Royal Motel. It had gained a nasty reputation in the couple of years since the murder-suicide, and he couldn't for the life of him remember how he'd let himself get talked into this excursion. His goal now was to get in and out as quickly as possible, but he knew that his friend had come along bearing tools for breaking locks. it would not be easy to dissuade him from exploring every room. "Last one there eats dog shit." The older boy stood on his pedals and began his descent to the deserted road below. No one had passed that way since they'd heard of the motel. After a moment, the younger boy shook his head and followed, hoping they'd be done before dark. You've been listening to Permanent Residence by author R.K. Kombrinck, as performed by yours truly. The Royal Motel makes that ratty Bates place look like amateur hour, wouldn't you say? And you know what? That story reminds me of another hotel, located on a dark, desert highway somewhere in California. I've heard it's a lovely place, with plenty of room. The only problem, you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Sound familiar? Up next, I've got another tale for you, my friends. This one from author Hunter Lowe. In it, we'll meet Joseph and his wife Beth, a retirement-age couple that's seen a lot in their nearly 6 decades, but they haven't seen anything like the week when all the insects started dying mysteriously. And unfortunately for them, the bugs were just the beginning. Without further ado, from author Hunter Lowe, I present to you The Envoy. Joseph Murick rocked back on his heels, pulling a sleeve of his thick cotton shirt over his nose. He stared at the ground, not making a sound. Oiling the gears, as his grandpa said. No amount of thought could bring him any resolution, however, 4 days in a row. By God, did it smell. The ground around Joseph's muddy boots was littered with corpses of birds. His dog, Hera, whined restlessly behind him, keeping her distance from the bird carcasses. This fact in itself alarmed him more than the event. Hera was fond of eating just about anything. Normally, a field full of easily accessible birds would have looked much akin to a free buffet. He sank to a knee, casting his eyes among the fallen animals. It was getting worse, whatever it was. It started 4 days ago when his wife Beth came sprinting toward the house at full speed. Rounding 60 years of age, this was a sight to behold. Her blue sundress billowed behind her, sending her rocking off balance as she ran. Long curly strands of graying black hair bounced along behind her as she kicked off her loose sandals, picking up speed. Joseph smiled. What a racket. She had been shrieking his name the whole way, skipping over twigs, tree roots, and other obstacles that separated her from their small, upstate New York cottage. Her shrill cries drew Joseph out of his armchair. As he neared the worn screen door, Beth rocketed by him, almost knocking him off balance and barely making it through the closing door. "The ducks!" she screamed from inside the house. Joseph stepped outside, lingering on the threshold. Beth's face was white, even whiter than usual. Her chest heaved and her hair framing her face was matted with sweat. Joseph knitted his brow in confusion and turned toward their small boathouse. "They're everywhere! Filthy damn things!" she continued, wailing from the security of their kitchen. For someone so accustomed to the flora and fauna of their environment, she still turned into a terrified schoolgirl when faced with bugs. Joseph laughed then. It hadn't been funny in the end. The boathouse path Joseph dug out in his younger days began to show signs of disrepair, and to tell the truth, he simply didn't have the energy to maintain it anymore. He walked down the bumpy, root-snarled road, taking in a deep breath of moist air. Rain tonight, probably. He kept his pace slow but steady. At his doctor's behest, he was to take it easy. Very easy. After his second heart attack, he was a ticking time bomb. It was then that he noticed the quiet. No more than 10 steps ago, the low thrum of crickets and cicadas could be heard chattering through the woods. Now, nothing. He paused. He could see the lumpy silhouette of the partially repaired boathouse over the scrub brush. It was on the wrong side of a rotten tree last fall, and the insurance company was taking their sweet time. Besides the eerie quiet, everything seemed normal. He turned toward his destination and planted his right foot. The crunch that issued from underneath his boot traveled all the way up his body. He yanked his foot back, staggering to catch his balance. "Oh, Christ," he said. The ground was littered with insects, almost to the point of choking the path, and it only became worse as the trail neared the boathouse. Dread settled over him like a thick woolen coat. His bones ached, and he knew for damn sure he wasn't going any further. He turned on his heel and began walking back to the house, his pulse rising to alarming levels. There were thousands of them, all dead. He decided that a quicker pace in the return trip was worth the risk. He swung open the screen door to the house and pushed past Hera. Beth was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a glass of what most assuredly was not water. She looked up as he entered. He could tell she was still on the verge of tears. "Did you see them?" she said. Her left leg jogged up and down nervously. "I saw them." Joseph crossed the yellowed linoleum of the kitchen floor, tugging off the cap Beth knitted for him years ago. His hair had all chosen to abandon ship before going gray. Maybe some kind of chemical got loose from a farm nearby, but I'm not positive. The sheer number of them was... He stuffed the cap into the pocket of a hanging coat near the door. "Fucked up?" Beth said. That sounds about right. Joseph nodded. It was fucked up, all right. I'm going to give animal control a call in the morning. Let's keep Hera in for the night. She'll stick with one of us until we figure this out. Beth nodded warily as she watched Joseph lock the front door for the first time in years. Neither slept well that evening. Now this. Shaken from his daydreaming by the pungent aroma, Joseph marveled once more at the sheer amount of death. The fallen birds ranged widely in everything from size to species. Joseph was no ornithologist, or even a bird watcher for that matter, but he knew damn well that entire clouds of birds didn't just drop from the sky. Hera whined at him again. He reached down and stroked the big dog behind her ears. "You're telling me." He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, suddenly feeling that they were no longer alone. "Let's get out of here, girl." He retreated from what felt like a crime scene, just as he did the past 3 days, his heart racing uncomfortably in his chest. The woods around their home grew still and quiet as the days slipped by. Beth often refused to come out of the house. After her encounter with the legions of dead insects, she found better ways to spend her time. Indoors. Weeds were already sprouting up in her once pristine garden, and Joseph brushed right by them on his way back to the house. Hera nosed her way in front of him, eager to get inside. "What is it now?" Beth called from across the house. She was engrossed in her knitting. That was good. "Honestly?" Joseph said. "Honestly." Birds. Joseph made his way through the small kitchen into the living room, approaching the phone. A whole hell of a lot of dead birds. The clicking of metal needles stopped. "Here we go." "You said you would call that man back if..." Her voice began to rise as she spoke. Calm down, calm down." Joseph raised both of his hands, backing to the room slowly. "I'm calling him right now." He picked up the receiver and dug a scrap of paper out of his pocket. On it was scribbled the name and number of the local sheriff, not one of his favorite people. Nonetheless, the man offered up his personal contact information during their last meeting, just in case anything else strange happened. Beth calmed visibly and slumped back in her chair. The rhythmic click of knitting needles resumed. Joseph punched the number into the phone, and after 2 beats, a voice answered on the other side of the line. "Officer Coolin, it's Joseph." No response. "Murick, Joseph Murick, the guy with all the dead bugs." Joseph closed his eyes and massaged his forehead with his thumb and index finger. "Mr. Murick, I'm sorry. Always been bad with names. Won't forget tramping around ankle deep in bugs anytime soon, though. Is everything all right?" The younger man asked. "It's getting worse," Joseph said. "Went for a look today and the entire area has a fresh layer of dead birds." "Birds?" Coughlin's voice took on a tinge of worry. "How many are we talking?" "I don't know." Joseph lowered his voice, glancing at Beth. "Hundreds." "Shit," Coughlin said. "I'm on my way. I'll bring some of the animal boys to help clean up." "Thanks." Joseph hung up the receiver. He needed a drink. 2 hours later, Joseph stood in the woods once more, this time accompanied by 3 other men. The sheriff wore his standard officer's uniform and stood about a head shorter than Joseph. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes and sweat ran down his face from the hairline of his black buzz cut. The other 2 looked like a series of mugshots come to life. Big, tough, and ugly were a few descriptors that immediately came to mind. They wore grungy jeans. The larger of the 2 sported a black sleeveless shirt picturing a grinning skull. Charming. The 3 men carried an array of equipment ranging from shovels to strange elongated pieces of aluminum topped with metal hooks. Joseph was less than keen to discover just how they would be using those long silver rods. You weren't kidding. Officer Coughlin pinched his nose. Jesus, the smell! The 2 larger fellows didn't seem to mind the stench. Get to work, boys. Joseph and I need to talk. He motioned to Joseph to step away. Joseph followed the sheriff upwind, hoping for a respite from the smell. Anything this time? Coughlin said. Joseph shook his head. No, nothing that either of us noticed. It was the same way with the bugs and the... Joseph scrunched his nose. His eyes watered a bit. Fish? Coughlin finished for him. That was something special. He moved around Joseph, removing a small camera from the pocket of his pants. The small silver rectangle shimmered when struck by the odd ray of sunlight piercing the normal gloom. I'm going to take some photos again, and then I guess we'll get to work debirding your property. The small camera beeped and extended its lens. Joseph watched Coughlin move around the scene while taking a few careful photographs. He caught the 2 men from animal control and a few to offer perspective of the amount of dead birds in comparison to the large fellows. Oil in the gears. Joseph removed his hat and rubbed a rough hand over his scalp. It's moving up, isn't it? Joseph felt a chill. Coughlin stopped in his tracks, lowering the camera. Up what? Coughlin asked. The food chain. Joseph's heart jumped up a few notches. First bugs, then fish, and now birds. All of them around my boathouse. What the hell is going on here, Coughlin? Calm down, Joseph. Coughlin rested a hand on Joseph's shoulder, reaching up to compensate for height. His grip was firm, reassuring. For now, let's get this cleaned up. The faster we get this done, the easier you'll sleep tonight. Coughlin squeezed the older man's shoulder, then headed for the truck. It's some weird shit, that's for sure. Luckily for you, someone took an interest, especially after I reported in today. He reached into the truck's bed, retrieved a long pole, and handed it to Joseph. A crew from the city is coming to have a look at your boathouse and the surrounding area tomorrow afternoon, round 1. Joseph breathed a sigh of relief. Finally. He seized the metal rod from Coughlin and sneered. Let's go bag some birds. Tools in hand, the men set about spending their final afternoon together. Yep. Joseph speared a dead bird on the tip of his aluminum pole. I knew I wasn't going to like what these did. He hefted the bird over to a growing pile near Coughlin's truck and shook it loose. It landed with a damp, stomach-churning smack and tumbled down the growing mound of carcasses. Gonna take you all day if you keep bringing one in at a time, Graham Laurel, the larger of the animal control boys, muttered. He rested the tip of the pole he carried on the mound and slid 6 dead birds off of his hook with a bloody work boot. He was young, a bit of an asshole, and a full head taller than Joseph. He found something to moan about every few minutes once the conversations died down and the real work began. Would you like to join me and my wife for dinner sometime, Graham? Joseph said. I just can't get enough of that winning personality. Graham spat on the ground and walked back through his cleared path through the slain fowl. He leaned the pole on his shoulder and raised his left hand, lazily wagging his middle finger through the air. Mr. Laurel, how about a little respect for a taxpayer that makes sure you see a paycheck? Sheriff Coughlin said he passed the goon. Graham spat again, dropped his middle finger, and stomped further into the woods. Coughlin approached the truck. He shrugged. He's not a bad kid. Little bit of a temper and complains more than my grandmother, but not a bad kid. Now, the other one, Dwayne. He's a piece of work. I'm sure, Joseph said. He'd already dismissed the exchange, his mind mulling over the situation at hand. In fact, he would still be thinking about what tomorrow would bring, when Graham met the owl. Graham Laurel was pissed. He had forgotten to put sunscreen on his head. A bald patch had already begun to show among his tightly cut blonde hair and was now most certainly a bright, angry red. He poked the top of his sweat-slicked scalp and cringed. Just fucking perfect. "Hotter than shit," Graham said. He turned toward the old man's boathouse, combing the ground with his eyes. Damn dead birds everywhere. He spotted a crow laying on the ground, undamaged beside the parade of ants crawling out of its eye sockets. He grimaced. Sick. He took a step back and hefted his aluminum pole. He jabbed the sharpened point into the bird and lifted it into the air. Ants rained down briefly as he swung the dead bird further away from him, and then he saw it. The owl. It occurred to him that he never saw an owl before. He never really cared about it. Until now. It sat up on a branch directly ahead of him, its pale face turned toward Graham. Large, yellow, unblinking eyes greeted his. What the hell is an owl doing out in the daylight? The owl ruffled its wings and turned its head. Graham had to stifle a shriek. The sudden move caught him off guard. The bird took a few careful steps to the left on the branch, almost like it was trying to see around Graham. "Can I help you, man?" Graham called up at the bird. Its lidless eyes returned to him. The white and brown plumage covered its body didn't seem to move at all. "Hey!" Graham waved his hands. The owl did not flinch. What the fuck? Graham dropped the aluminum pole with a metallic thump and scanned the ground for an object. Bingo. A large pine cone lay nearby, one side coated in dried mud. He hefted it in his right hand. He looked around, scanning for the old man and that damned sheriff. The coast was clear. The owl continued to stare. Graham could feel it looking into him. "Cut it out, man!" Graham, a natural-born pitcher with long, sinewy arms, squinted, aiming at the bird. His arm cocked back, then released like it was spring-loaded. The pine cone spun through the air, right on target. "Oh shit, I really hummed that." The pine cone bounced off of the small bird unfazed, but obviously injured. A chunk of feathers had been torn out of its chest by the projectile. Small dots of blood began to peek above the skin. Regardless, it continued to stare. Graham took a step backwards. "What the?" The owl moved again, its gaze returning to Graham's left. It wobbled on the branch, attempting to right itself drunkenly. "The hell are you staring at?" Graham shouted, but the lifeless form of the owl pitching to the ground stopped him. He froze in place. Something was wrong. He turned to his left slowly. His skin felt cold. He didn't see anything in the dwindling afternoon light, but something saw him. He felt a strange sensation and then burning hooks dug into his mind. He tried to scream, but realized that he was physically unable. His body was locked in place, along with his eyes, frozen in the direction he and his old friend the owl had been looking. As panic set in, he felt the burning barbs recede a little. Young and strong Graham. Graham. Graham tried to scream again. Nothing. What the fuck was that? The pain increased in his head. A bonfire smoldered behind his eyes. The agony slowly faded to a dull hum, but it never lost its unflinching hold. Still too strong, perhaps. Joseph's dog barked in the distance. The pain increased again, this time exponentially. Images flashed through his mind unbidden until he couldn't help but think of Lassie. He felt his lips curl into an uncomfortable grin. "What is the name for this creature, Graham?" "Dog. It's a dog. Let me go, please. God, please don't kill me." "I am sorry. Yes, sorry, Graham. I was not ready. You would have been spared pain." Graham shrieked inside his own mind with such force that the paralyzing barbs receded for a moment. Graham's mouth flopped open. "Dog!" Graham stated loudly. Sheriff Coughlin crunched through the foliage, snapping twigs with his heavy leather boots. The sun was going down and light was running low. Dwayne already stowed the gear and claimed a shotgun for the ride back. They decided to call it quits for the day. but no one had heard from or seen Graham for over an hour. He was sure he had went this way. Hera barked somewhere behind him. "Dog!" The voice of Graham boomed out from ahead. The sheriff, not liking the deadpan tone to the young man's voice, sprinted in Graham's direction. Who the hell was he talking to? That voice was Graham, all right, but wrong. He crashed through the undergrowth and came to a skidding stop at the prone form of Graham, twitching madly on the ground. White foam began to press between his tightly clenched teeth. His eyes rolled in their sockets like loose marbles. Coughlin dropped to his knees, unfastening his leather belt, pulling it out from around his waist with a snap. "Don't choke on your tongue, you bastard." He pried the youth's mouth open and released his jaws once the belt was between them. After a few seconds, the seizing stopped. Graham was whiter than a sheet. His breath came in short, whispery gasps. "Graham, what happened?" He pulled the belt slowly out of Graham's mouth, letting it drop to the ground. Graham opened his mouth slowly. At first, only a wet, choking sound came out. The dog, it... He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It wants the dog now." Blood began to run freely from his nostrils. He shook uncontrollably. Before long, the body Sheriff Coughlin held lay still. The small breaths faded. "Graham!" He shook the boy. "Jesus, what happened?" In front of him, something moved, yet the movement left no trace. His heart jumped into his throat. I couldn't even see it. What the fuck is going on? Leaves drifted to the ground where the disturbance occurred. The dog. The sheriff dropped the body of Graham Laurel and bolted to his feet. "Joseph, get away from the dog!" he called out. Joseph massaged his left shoulder. It always started to ache toward the evening. The area looked considerably better than it had. Most of the visible birds were cleared away by the small crew. He did not envy whoever had to tie up the giant plastic sack of dead animals, however. Not even the Laurel boy. Hera barked behind him. He started, cursing out loud. "The hell's wrong with you?" Joseph turned toward the dog. "You scared the shit out of me." "Mind keeping a lid on the mutt?" Dwayne Laurel growled from inside the truck. He had his dirty boots propped up on the dash while Coughlin wasn't around. Joseph decided against responding. His recent chats with Dwayne were unpleasant at best. Hera whined strangely and backed away from the truck, her tail tucked between her legs. Her tongue hung loosely out of her mouth. Her breath came in loud, jagged gasps. A growl ripped through the air. Joseph watched in horror as the dog that never so much as playfully nipped at someone turned into a frightened, murderous animal. Hera. What's wrong? Joseph backed away from the truck and the snarling dog. He turned quickly toward the woods. He could have sworn he heard someone call his name. Hera growled low in her throat. Strings of saliva hung from her jaws. She looked as though she was about to leap upon some unseen predator. When she froze in place, the horrible snarl etched itself onto her face. Her eyes blank and glassy. Her heaving abdomen was all but completely still. As far as he could tell, she wasn't breathing at all. "The hell's up with your dog, man?" Dwayne sat up, opening the door slightly. The sound of the wheezing sheriff crashed out of the woods. Hera regarded him indifferently. "Joseph!" Sheriff Coughlin inched his right hand toward the small leather strap holding a service pistol in place. "Get back to the house!" "My dog," Joseph protested. "Shoot the fucking thing, Sheriff, it's rabid!" Dwayne pulled the door of the truck closed again. The locks clicked from within. "Graham's dead!" The leather strap snapped loose with a click. Last thing he said was, "It wants the dog." He pulled the pistol, leveling it at Hera. Joseph took a startled step forward. "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You can't just shoot my dog, man!" Coughlin took a step towards Hera, his gun still raised. "I don't know what's going on here anymore." Panic clawed at the edge of the sheriff's voice. "All I know is that a dying boy very clearly told me something wanted your dog. So, yes, I'm sure as shit about to shoot your dog." He squinted. His finger tightened on the trigger of the pistol. Hera collapsed to the ground. Coughlin lowered his pistol, stunned. "Hera!" Joseph jogged around the truck. His chest hurt something awful. Coughlin wiped sweat out of his eyes. I don't think I did anything in time. Joseph examined his dog. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was dead. Aside from a small amount of blood seeping from her nose and ears, she looked completely unharmed. The sound of car doors unlocking caused him to jerk his head up. Shit. He had forgotten about Dwayne. Dead? The car door creaked open. Dwayne unwound his 6-foot frame and stepped outside. Graham is fucking dead? His brown eyes bulged with terror. No way! I'm not fucking dying here! Dwayne sprinted up the road away from the Murick house. Stop! The voice of Graham Laurel dragged itself from the form of the prone dog. Holy shit. Coughlin raised his pistol. Joseph fell, madly scooting away from Harris' corpse. Dwayne, stop! Graham shouted through Harris' still mouth. Dwayne stopped on the road ahead and turned around. Get away from the dog, Joseph. Coughlin thumbed the safety of his pistol off. Joseph scrambled to the other side of the truck, his heart racing. Graham? Dwayne took a few uneasy steps back towards the truck. Don't listen, Dwayne! Coughlin shouted from the truck. Dwayne ignored the sheriff and took a few more steps back toward the group. Harris' jaws stretched into a horrific grin. Oh shit, Dwayne, get back! Coughlin fired 3 rounds into the dog. Blood and fur arched through the air. Up the road, Dwayne froze mid-step, his jaw sagging open lazily. Get back to your house, Joseph. Coughlin still had his gun drawn, and he walked toward the driver's seat of the van. Go inside. I'm calling in more units. Something is fucked here. Joseph obeyed the good sheriff, who died mid-step, a heartbeat, after completing that same sentence. Something watched Sheriff Coughlin move toward the front of his truck. The enveloping, tenebrous intelligence that Graham and Dwayne Laurel encountered had grown strong. Clawing up from animals, it was ready for its intended prey. The air shifted around Dwayne. A breeze ruffled Coughlin's hair. He froze mid-stride. Finally, you make sense. Everything that made Coughlin more than just a biological organism was destroyed instantly. With a great, invisible devouring, it consumed the sheriff. It reveled in its conquest, savoring. The man that was Coughlin stared blankly into space, his jaw hanging open. Joseph raised his hands over his head, carefully breathing in 3-second intervals, something he had been taught to slow down the old ticker. 1, 2, 3. He let his breath escape. 1, 2, 3. He was almost to the house. He would just throw all the locks closed on the doors and sit down. He wheezed up the small incline leading to the back door, pausing to take a few more breaths at the door. 1, 2. His gaze pivoted back to the truck. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. The police truck remained unperturbed. Its driver's side door never opened. Backup never called for. His breathing rhythm fell to pieces. He sucked air in with sharp, jagged hitches. He felt cold. A tingle began to spread from the center of his chest, radiating outwards. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. He forced his jagged breathing to a halt, pulling in another deep gasp of air. He had to get inside. He turned, extending his right arm and throwing the screen door open. It clattered off the side of the house, swinging shut with a slow whine. Joseph scrambled to the back door, locking it behind him and flipping all of the porch lights on. He heard Beth stand up in the living room, approaching with slow, uneven steps. She must have been asleep. All finished? Beth rubbed at her eyes, ending the sentence with an unceremonious yawn while pulling off her old bulky headphones. She didn't hear. Beth, Joseph said. 1, 2, 3. Lock the front door. Fuck it, lock all the windows too. Joseph, you're scaring me. She was fully awake now. What happened? Just, please go lock up. He approached his wife, squeezing her shoulders gently. I'll tell you after I call the station. Wait, we need to let Hera in. Beth moved to push past her husband. He didn't move. Elizabeth, don't, Joseph said. His wife looked up at him. If something's out there, then we need her. Her voice raised to her no longer messing around tone. Hera is dead, Beth, Joseph said. Beth whimpered. Her shoulders slumped. Just, please, go lock up. I'll explain after I call the station. She nodded, tear-brimmed eyes blinking rapidly. Beth looked ready to burst with questions, but Joseph's stern gaze squelched any further interrogation. She set about sliding old locks into place and drawing the curtains shut across the various windows. Joseph shakily approached the old wall-mounted plastic phone, willing himself to calm down. He snagged the receiver and punched in 911. Nothing. He hung the phone up, then lifted it to his ear again. Nothing. No fucking dial tone. He slammed the phone into its cradle. Joseph pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes and rubbed. Brilliant colors ran across his vision. He felt clammy, sick. Beth was finished with her errand, entering the living room at a rapid pace. Joseph, Beth whispered. She walked slowly, sticking to the most interior wall of the house as if monstrous hands would burst through any window or door and yank her through. What's happening? Joseph approached the back door. He slid the curtain obscuring his view of the police truck aside, except there was no police truck now. He closed his eyes slowly. That's impossible. He breathed and opened his eyes. No truck. Not so much as tire depressions in the long grass of his backyard. Nothing at all. Joseph? Beth squeaked. Remember the argument we got into about whether or not we should own a gun? Joseph turned back to his wife. Yeah? Why? Go get the gun. You're about to be glad I want that one, Joseph said. Beth puffed up to the second story of their house. They built the place back in the 70s, and Joseph wasn't what you called handy. Stairs creaked, and exposed nails hit around the most innocent of corners, ready to snag an elbow or rip a brand new shirt. She paused, stepping awkwardly over the second to highest step. It was loose. Joseph promised to fix it about 2 months ago. She paused when she made it to the second floor. It was getting dark quickly, and the shadow-filled hallway stretching around the corner filled her with a nameless sense of dread. She flicked on lights as she proceeded toward the master bedroom and the small closet that held the shotgun. She darted into Joseph's office, turning on the primary lamp as she went. The locks on these windows had a layer of paint over them, so she used a metal paperweight to pound them closed. Once done, she left the office. She turned left at the end of the hallway and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. It was always dark in here. She instinctively groped to the right, grasping the 3 switches that controlled the lights to their room. She flipped them all on, but the room remained shrouded in the gloomy darkness. She could see far enough inside to locate the closet. The hallway light still worked, but something much more than a bad feeling began to inch itself into her mind. She thought about turning and calling down to Joseph, but stopped. Don't be a child. She took a cautious step into the master bedroom. See, not so bad. She made her way around their king-sized bed. She navigated this room hundreds of times in the dark. She reached the far wall, feeling for the door of the closet. Cold metal brushed against her hand. She seized the knob and paused. She didn't want to open it. In fact, she never wanted to avoid something so badly. She released the knob. She had to decide fast. The darkness was scaring her. Fucking fuck it. The sound of her curses gave her the boost to grasp the knob and twist, opening the closet. She cringed, but nothing bound out of the darkness to rip her limb from limb. She smiled to herself and entered. Let's find this gun and get back downstairs. She flipped the light switch in the closet out of habit. The bulb bloomed to life. and then shattered, sending a rain of glass and filament down onto the closet floor. "Oh God!" Beth covered her head with her hands. Tiny bits of debris bounced off her skin and nestled into her hair. Her heart hammered in her chest. She blindly groped for the shotgun. It rested at its normal spot, propped up against the back right corner. She seized it and sprinted out of the dark bedroom, aching for the comforting light of the hallway. Joseph could hear his wife scurrying back toward the stairs from below. He left his post by the back door and moved toward the stairway. Eventually, she arrived at the top of the stairwell, clutching the dusty old shotgun. Joseph took 2 long strides up the stairs and extended a hand. Beth tossed him the gun. "Thanks, honey," Joseph said. "What's happening? The power in our room didn't work. Everything else was all right, though." Beth shook her head. "Think a fuse?" "No, not a fuse." Joseph turned and, taking the stairs 2 at a time, headed for the kitchen. Crossing to the pantry, he began rummaging for the unopened box of shotgun shells. "Something is out there. I'm not sure what." Joseph pushed aside a few boxes of oatmeal. "Gotta watch that cholesterol." He snapped the heavy box out of one of the darker corners of the pantry, plopped it on the table, and set about clumsily loading the firearm. "Something? Like an animal? Oh God, did those poor boys get attacked by something?" Beth's eyes widened with panic, already glassing over with tears. "No, not an animal," Joseph said. A shell slipped out of his grip and skittered across the floor. He paid it no mind. "Well, it could be, I suppose. I haven't seen it, so I don't really know what to tell you." The final shell clicked into place. He felt a surge of courage. "All I know is that we're staying inside until it's light. Nothing gets opened until morning." "Why don't we just call someone?" Beth made for the phone but was stopped by the way Joseph looked at her. "No phone?" Joseph shook his head. He watched her entire frame begin to tremble ever so slightly. He let the shotgun lean against a nearby cabinet and massaged the left side of his chest in slow circles with his right hand. Beth was on the move before he could stop her. She returned with a small orange plastic bottle containing his medication. Joseph smiled gratefully, accepting the small bottle, letting his fingers linger over hers for a few seconds. Joseph trundled to the refrigerator, pulling it open with a soothing swoosh. The cold air against his face felt nice. He grabbed a bottle of water, snapped it open, and popped a few of the minuscule pills into his mouth. Some of the anxiety burning low in the back of his head began to fade. The medicine always helped. The Murick family sat down at their kitchen table, a loaded shotgun on display instead of a home-cooked meal, and waited. Beth sprawled across the table, her hair covered her face, puffing out in a slow rhythm to match her breathing. Joseph yawned. His eyes felt itchy. He scrunched his face and rotated his neck, issuing a loud series of cracks. Beth mumbled something across the table but remained asleep. The oven's display glowed in the background. Only 3 in the morning. It was still pitch black outside and completely silent. Nothing disturbed them since the disappearance of the sheriff, and that set him on edge. Joseph stood up as quietly as he could in a creaky old house and took the shotgun from the table. He crept, quiet footstep by footstep, until he was face to face with the small, eye-level window above the back door. His left hand shook as he began to draw back the blinds, not sure what he was even looking for, but nothing greeted him. The porch lights hummed pleasantly, bathing their porch in a yellowish light. All evidence of the truck and its crew vanished, something that still troubled him deeply. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever came to the area had lost interest in an old man and his wife. Just maybe. "No, Joseph, I'm still here." Joseph stifled a scream. The voice came from just outside of the back door. It sounded wrong. He could understand what was being said, but the words sounded robotic, like someone who just learned French struggling with their first restaurant order. "Not without kindness, Joseph." Hair stood on the back of his neck. His hands quaked. Beth remained asleep at this table. Something told him this conversation was private. "You will have your night. What is left of it. I am no," it paused. "Murderer, yes. Murderer, I have learned. I have felt what your microscopic kind call an excuse for feelings, for emotions. The strange accent began to fade. The voice became clearer, louder. It became human. I have felt your needless fear, your struggle, the voice of Sheriff Coughlin said through the thin wooden door. But do not be afraid. The voice lowered, becoming quiet. Soon you'll join us, Graham Laurel cried out joyfully. Joseph staggered away from the door, the shotgun bouncing wildly as he attempted to steady his aim at the door. The doorway was quiet now. The sound of feet leaving the area of the back door was absent. Complete silence. Once more. Joseph? Beth picked her head up, pushing her hair out of her face. Joseph lowered the shotgun and put on his best fake smile. His wife rubbed her eyes. What time is it? Only about 3-ish. He glanced at the back door. Still a ways to go yet, I'm afraid. He walked back to the kitchen table, extending a hand to his wife. Things have been quiet. Why don't we go get more comfortable? He smiled. She smiled back. Oh, if you really think it's safe. Beth stood up and accompanied her husband upstairs. They left the hall lights on. Beth became nervous when they rounded the corner to a completely lit master bedroom. She'd left the switches on during her excursion for the gun. Maybe it was just the old house after all. Joseph shrugged. He crossed to his side of the bed and sat down. More than anything, he longed to sleep. What about that thing? Beth sat down next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. That animal or whatever it was. I think it got bored. How about we just relax for a while? Joseph threw his right arm over Beth's shoulder, pulling her in close. They sat this way for a while, both tired, but happy to be together. Only one knowing that this night would most likely be their last. Sleep wasn't much of an option, so they sat together, talking through the long hours of the night while the rest of the township around them slept. They talked about their upcoming trip across country to bask in the Pacific sun. They talked about their children, long ago grown and moved off to start their own lives. All three of them more than proving their ability to handle the wild world outside of their parents' door. Joseph struggled to keep composure. As time dragged on, he became more and more terrified. He had to remain calm for Beth. Soon, conversation began to wane and Beth's eyelids grew heavy. She would fall asleep for a few short seconds, then wake back up with a start. Joseph smiled and pulled back the sheets on the bed. Wordlessly, Beth slid into them, fluffing her pillows, the very picture of comfort. In no time at all, she fell blissfully asleep. Joseph lay next to her, his right hand still entwined with hers. He craned his neck around the sleeping form of his wife. The bright blue display of the clock caused his heart to sink. 5 a.m. How much longer would they have? He slid out of the bed. 35 years of marriage armed him with the ability to disengage from any of Beth's encompassing embraces undetected. Before leaving, he leaned over his wife and planted a kiss on her forehead. She stirred slightly as if unconsciously acknowledging it. Joseph took a deep breath and walked across the room to the door. He glanced behind him and smiled. Nothing will touch her. Not as long as I'm here. He hefted the weight of the shotgun onto his shoulder and walked toward his study. He pushed the door open and grinned. He kicked off his shoes, letting his sore feet enjoy the plush carpet. The air was musky with the scent of years of cigar smoke. Joseph took up the habit a while back, much to Beth's displeasure. He avoided his desk. The plush leather armchair seemed much more enticing. He recalled hours of smoky viewings of SportsCenter, drinks shared with good friends, many of whom had moved far away enough to drift into obscurity. He flipped open the lid of the lacquered brown box resting on the small side table. He produced a cigar and a lighter from within. There would be no opening of windows this time, no hiding, just pure enjoyment. He bit into the cigar and clicked open the silver lighter. His thumb flicked the ignition once, but no flame. He huffed. The lighter clicked again as he attempted another light. Nothing. Motherfucker, Joseph growled through his mostly closed mouth. He flicked the lighter again and the small TV in his office lit up. Static roared through the room. White light blinded him momentarily. The cigar fell from his mouth. Where's the damn remote? He scrambled out of his chair, slapping at the buttons lining the side of the TV. Eventually, the noise ceased. His ears rung. "Yeah, tough guy?" Joseph looked around the room, waiting for his assailant. Nothing followed but silence. He crossed the room, returning to his chair. He snatched the cigar and lighter from their spots on the floor. He clicked the lighter open. This time, a bright red flame danced merrily after the first strike. He moved the lighter closer, puffing the cigar to life. Thick, oily fumes soon filled the room. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of rest. "Joseph!" Joseph's eyes shot open and he grabbed the shotgun. Nothing in the room moved. He was alone. Cold fear began to press its way up his spine. He stood up from the chair, breathing as calmly as he could. He pushed open the door with the barrel of his gun and peeked out. He walked the hallway and peered around the corner to see Beth dozing in the room down the hall. Aside from that, nothing out of the ordinary. He returned to his office, still examining the hallway. "Joseph!" The voice spoke from directly behind him. He cried out and jumped back into the hall, spinning and firing the shotgun. The blast shook him from head to toe. The shot tore the computer on his desk apart. The only casualty in the room was his 5-year-old PC. "Son of a bitch!" He clutched the left side of his chest. He glanced again at the master bedroom. The door was shut. No, no, no! He ran to the door, frantically turning the knob in both hands. Locked. He pounded his fists on the door. "Beth! Wake up!" No noise issued from inside of the room. He spun to face the empty hallway. "Don't you touch her!" He yelled into the morning air. The only reply was the faint sound of glass breaking from downstairs. Gooseflesh sprang up across both his arms. He pulled the gun up, ejecting the spent shell from the chamber. The stairs were empty, as far as he could tell. More glass breaking from downstairs, followed by what he could only describe as a strange grunt. Joseph pressed his back against the far wall of the stairs and proceeded toward the back door, gun held at shoulder height. He reached the bottom of the stairs and looked through the kitchen. The screen door lay on the ground, ripped from the hinges. The back door hung open. The white eyelet drapes dangling from the windows were streaked with the blood. Glass littered the floor. Something, or someone else was inside the house. But whatever he was dealing with did not seem to be troubled by barriers, physical or otherwise. Sheriff Coughlin barreled into Joseph from behind, sending the older man sprawling across the floor. He was half convinced that he would blow his own head off when he landed on the shotgun. The two men tumbled to the ground. The shotgun came loose from Joseph's grip and clattered across the floor, coming to rest near the wall by the back door. "Interesting," Sheriff Coughlin spoke in the same strange voice he heard throughout the evening. "Such specimens you are." The sheriff shoved Joseph off of him and stood. Joseph crawled toward the shotgun only to feel the hands of the stout man close around his right foot. His hand squeaked across the wooden floor as Coughlin dragged him into the kitchen. The sheriff moved strangely, like a man who spent far too much time on a boat than dry land. Joseph kicked out with his left leg, striking Coughlin just behind his right knee. He staggered and fell, losing his grip on Joseph's wriggling foot. Clumsy, however. Coughlin quickly regained his balance. Joseph shrieked and backed toward the door. Small fragments of glass shredded his palms. Bloody handprints marked his traversal across the floor. Sheriff Coughlin towered menacingly over him. His eyes rolled up to their whites and opened wide. Far too wide. Bulging blood vessels ran over the milky white surface of those eyes. His mouth hung open in a mask of terror. His open jaw twisted in a horrible, muted scream that allowed the strange voice to pour out. This one did not like you. Coughlin took a wobbly step toward Joseph. Crazy old bastard. Coughlin's own voice escaped from his paralyzed mouth. Another step. This one steadier. Joseph shook himself free of his terror. The shotgun. Where is... Coughlin darted forward and pulled Joseph up from the floor by the collar of his shirt. Joseph cried out and struck Coughlin a heavy blow to the temple with his right hand. Coughlin's grip remained strong. So much hate in all of you. This is what you all want, below all of your niceties and manners. Coughlin released his right hand and dealt Joseph a thundering blow to the side of his head. Color exploded behind Joseph's eyes. He sagged momentarily, unable to reorient himself. I've learned everything about you that I could possibly ever need to make my choice. He struck Joseph again, this time a backhand across the other side of his face. Joseph grunted. Blood seeped from between his lips. His nose hurt like hell. Joseph rocked his hand back and pitched forward, slamming his forehead into those terrifying eyes. A satisfying crunch answered. The Coughlin thing released its grip and stumbled backwards. Joseph dropped to the ground and snatched the gun, leveling it at Coughlin. What the fuck are you? Joseph felt like he was going to faint, but held his ground. I am the first of many. The Envoy. Coughlin gargled what may have been a laugh. Are you? Joseph had so many questions, but Coughlin interrupted his line of thought. I'm with your wife now. The voice was cold. Joseph fired. Coughlin crumpled backwards, his torso shredded by the close proximity of the blast. His corpse crashed into the kitchen table, knocking aside chairs and smashing loose plates. All the same, all so violent, it said through Coughlin's still mouth. Joseph paid the being no heed and stormed up the stairs. His chest began to throb alarmingly before his confrontation with the good sheriff. Now, it was full-blown spasm of agony arching through his left arm. So be it. If he was going to die, at least his own body would do the job. The door to the master bedroom was now wide open. The room was silent. The large window, which was no longer covered by curtains, showed the sun peeking over the horizon. Joseph entered the room. Beth. Oh, God. His left hand rose to cover his mouth. Beth was sitting bolt upright in bed. Her eyes stared out the window. Tears streamed down her cheeks. A strange smell permeated the air. Joseph knew he should be able to identify it, but was unable until he pulled the sheets back. Urine stained Beth's clothes and the bed underneath her. Shit. Oh, shit, Beth. Joseph crawled onto the bed. He let the shotgun drop from his grip. What did it matter? He gripped his wife by her arms. Beth, he asked, his voice quiet with worry. She turned her head slightly, drifting from the window to her husband. Her green eyes met with his and locked there. Joseph. A horrifyingly wide smile ripped across her face. She looked more like the Cheshire Cat than his wife. Her hand shot up, grabbing the side of his head. They felt like vices. Fingernails dug into the flesh of his scalp, drawing blood. Beth, you're hurting me! Joseph attempted to struggle, but she was so much stronger. Joseph, just look. It can all be over. She began to wrench her husband's head toward the window. He struggled briefly, fighting her until the pain in his chest was too much to bear. He let go. His head turned towards the window. He just wants to learn. Beth whispered into his ear. Outside, something shifted in the brightening dawn. You've been listening to The Envoy by author Hunter Lowe, as performed by yours truly. If any alien ambassadors ever try and get inside my head, I hope they don't suffer from claustrophobia. It's pretty crowded in there already, with all the voices encouraging me to burn things. attend funerals for fun, and tear the tags off every mattress I can get my hands on, regardless of the consequences. Well, if our new extraterrestrial overlords don't mind the noise, though, I say, the more the merrier. I'd like to personally thank you for joining me for this episode of Horror Hill. Don't forget to tune in next week, when I yet again regale you with a handful of tales to terrify, plumbed from the most depraved depths of the human imagination. Tonight's episode featured tales from the very talented R.K. Kombrinck and Hunter Lowe. Permanent Residence was presented courtesy of R.K. Kombrinck. R.K. is a writer and artist who lives in Cincinnati, Ohio with his wife and 2 sons. He is a founding cast member of the popular horror podcast, Night of the Living Podcast, enjoys iced tea, unsweet, and genuinely believes in Sasquatch. For more information about Night of the Living Podcast, visit their website at notlp.com. Books featuring R.K.'s tales, including collections of his own work and several anthologies, are available now on Amazon.com. Search for him by name to find them, as R.K. Kombrinck, last name spelled Kombrinck. The Envoy was created and brought to you courtesy of Hunter Lowe, and was his first published horror tale. Hunter currently resides in Denver, Colorado with his wife and daughter, where he can be found tinkering with his novel. A lifetime member of the Horror Sci-Fi Club, Hunter hopes to continue bringing odd and terrifying tales to readers around the globe. When not writing, he is running expansive Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, creating art for use in video games, designing infographics for work, and snuggling up with his family, watching the latest and greatest TV. For more information, follow Hunter on Twitter, where he can be found using the handle Ragnarok57. If you enjoyed what you've heard on tonight's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page, or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference, and it means a lot to me. If you'd like to hear a premium ad-free edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can become a patron for as little as $5 per month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, including past episodes of this program, all of our other shows, and hundreds of standalone releases, all of them ad-free and available to download or stream. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases, and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You'll find me personally on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. And don't forget, all of tonight's tales are featured in the horror anthology, Daylight Dims Volume 2. But tonight's program featured just a couple of the terrifying tales you'll find in the complete illustrated book. So what are you waiting for? Pick up your copy today of the book readers are saying scared the bejesus out of them, and that remind them of the old Alfred Hitchcock paperback anthologies they read as a kid. Once again, you'll find a link to the book in our episode notes, or visit simplyscarypodcast.com/daylightdims2. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/daylightdims2 with a number 2 at the end. Or simply search for it on Amazon.com. You can also learn more about the books in the series at daylightdims.com. Thanks very much for your support of indie horror and our featured authors. Until next week, listener, when we meet up once again atop the Horror Hill for yet another dance with darkness, I bid you good night. Sleep tight, listener, and whatever you do, if you hear scratching at your door, don't open it. The darkness may have found you, but it's up to you to let it in. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Horror Hill Podcast, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcast Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Jason Hill. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Felipe Ojeda, Luke Hodgkinson, and Jesse Cornett. Final mixing and mastering by executive producer and director Craig Groshak. The program's artwork by yours truly, Jason Hill. Logo by Craig Groshak. Got a terrifying tale of your own that you like performed? I take submissions. Email it to us today at submissions@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your work considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's submissions@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave us a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on social media to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and our other programs. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for Chilling Tales for Dark Nights as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew, and another episode of this program each and every week. And don't forget to hit the thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing, and leave a kind word. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next week with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. If darkness is what you're after, listener, your search is over. Yet, let it be known, you haven't found the darkness. The darkness has found you.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.